this year. Jumuiya is Kabarak University's journal that deals with East African community law. I'm proud to possibly say one of the, if not the leading journal that deals with East African community law within the region. I want to first of all apologize for starting late. It is mainly because we were trying to allow all our panelists to immediately join. So please forgive us for that. But I will try to handle the time and the moderation well so that we do not, we finish on time. My name is Dr. Harrison Bori. I am the co-editor-in-chief of Jumuiya Journal and an adjunct lecturer at Kabarak Law School. It is our tradition rather at Kabarak to always begin the sessions with a word of prayer. I have Salome, who's a finalist or just about to finish student at Kabarak University Law School, who's going to open for us with a word of prayer. And then we are going to take the EAC anthem and we will begin from there. So Salome, you have the floor.
Thank you, Dr. Harrison Bori, and let's pray. Father God, we come before you this afternoon. We thank you we worship you and honor your holy name. Father, I ask you that you may forgive us all our sins, which we have committed knowingly or unknowingly. I ask you that you may have mercy on us and forgive us. Father, thank you for the gift of life. Thank you for the gift of good health. Thank you for gathering us this afternoon at this particular place. Your Father, mighty King of Israel, mighty Father, I ask you that as we begin this meeting, may you be with us, may you guide us, and may you help us to understand whatever is going to be discussed. And whatever I've not prayed for, I ask the Holy Spirit to intercede on my behalf. Whatever I've prayed wrongly, I ask that you may forgive me. In Jesus' name I pray and believe. Amen.
Amen. Amen. Amen. Thank you. Thank you very much, Salome. Ladies and gentlemen, joining us from all different parts of the region and different parts of the world, welcome to this webinar. As I've already said, this is a Jumuiya webinar, the East African Community Law Journal, and we are covering the East African Community Democracy Backsliding, lessons from the 2025 Tanzanian general elections. I have, in my view, what I would call a star-studded panel here, individuals that I know have very deep knowledge and have reflected upon some of this topic specifically. So I'm really looking forward to having a great conversation with them. Miss Luciana Thuo is going to be our first speaker. She is an election governance expert. Currently, she was formerly with us at Kabarak, and I know she is specifically, and also she's also an advocate of the High Court of Kenya, who has been studying and reflecting and writing on elections in this region of Africa for a number of years now. So, Luciana, karibu sana, and thank you so much for honoring
Thank you, Harrison. Happy to be here.
Asante. We also have Mr. Tito Magoti. Mr. Tito Magoti is an international human rights lawyer, currently working on issues surrounding human rights in East Africa and around Africa. We are also very honored to have him. I know he has reflected and has deep knowledge about the situation in the region of, in the sub-region and in the region of Africa. So Tito, karibu sana, you're welcome. The third panelist that I have on this esteemed panel is Dr. Owiso Owiso. Dr. Owiso Owiso has a very illustrious CV. He's an international lawyer, scholar, and researcher whose primary interests and areas of specialization I know include public international law, international criminal law and justice, international arbitration and dispute settlement, and law of organization. He earned his doctorate in public international law from the University of Luxembourg. In 2022, he has taught international law at the University of Luxembourg and at the University of Groningen. He currently practices law within the region. And he is also a farmer, a lover of nature, and an amateur cyclist. He's a very good friend of mine. I'm very happy to host him here. And karibu sana daktari. The last panelist on this panel is Mr. Aaron Kiza. Mr. Aaron Kiza is the co-founder and managing partner at Kiza and Mugisha Advocates, I think based in Kampala, Uganda, if I'm not wrong. Aaron, please, you'll correct me if I get any of these details wrong. He holds a bachelor's degree from Uganda Christian University and a postgraduate diploma from the legal practice from the Law Development Center, the famous LDC in Kampala. He's an advocate of the High Court of Uganda, a member of the Uganda Law Society, and of course the East African Law Society. And he's also currently, if I'm not wrong, serving as a member of the Uganda Law Society Rule of Law Committee. Aaron Kiza, welcome and karibu sana.
Thank you. Thank you.
I want to give a small context about the conversation that we are about to have. If you just dropped from Mars, you might not know that it is a serious election season in East Africa. At least we have already had elections in Tanzania. We will have elections in Uganda in January. And after that, in 20, you will also not know that these elections have brought a lot of issues in relations to the rule of law, in relations to governance, and issues surrounding rule of law, governance, transparency, and accountability. The 2025 Tanzanian elections have received a lot of criticism from many organizations and individuals for failing to uphold democracy, rule of law, and respect for human rights. We have had many human rights issues before the elections, during the elections, and after the elections. Internet shutdowns, media crackdown, political repression, post-election violence. The situation has been deteriorating seriously. The post-election situation is still not as clear because there's still some tension within the country. So the questions we are trying to grapple with here, and my colleagues, my esteemed panels are going to help us, is what is the situation of democracy in the East African community? What are the challenges and the lessons learned from the 2025 elections in Tanzania? Uphold democracy, good governance, and rule of law. We will also tackle what role can EAC Election Observation Mission do, or what did it do wrong, and what can it do right in the future? What are the trends and the patterns to be expected in the coming elections, because it is election season. I'm going to welcome my first panelist, Ms. Luciana Thuo, who's going to open with addressing some of these questions, at least the core parts of these questions, in the next 10 minutes. So, Luciana, you have the floor.
Thank you, Harrison. Good afternoon, good evening, good morning, depending on where you're watching us from. Thank you so much for the opportunity to contribute to this conversation. I will do my best within the time allocated to just give some preliminary thoughts, and then we can come back with additional points in the next round. Your first question is, what is the condition or the situation of democracy in East Africa? And I think the best term that we could use to describe what democracy is like in the East African region is just a competitive authoritarian situation. And what we mean by this is there is no country that has failed to hold elections in the recent past, but those elections don't result in any substantive change in government. And it's not an East African phenomenon. Usually when we speak about bad elections, we think it's an African problem or an East African problem. It's a global phenomenon. Studies that have been done by people like Professor Nick Cheeseman and others are showing that 30% of all elections globally do not result in any change of government. And so even if you do have elections, you don't have any changes of government happening, and so you don't have any political parties changing rulership of the country. So no substantive changes happen in the rulership of the country. Of course, there are exceptions here and there, but that's a general trend that we're seeing globally, and Africa is just part of that pattern. What we are also seeing then is that democracy remains very fragile, and it's uneven in terms of its execution. And I'll come back to what I mean when I give examples. You have a domination of the electoral landscape with legalistic, administrative, and structural manipulations. It's something that has been called elsewhere weaponization of elections or lawfare. So what we mean by this is that the landscape of the election is not determined on election day. In fact, I like that Professor Cheeseman and Brian Klaas say only amateurs rig elections on election day. Elections are rigged way before elections ever happened. And so what tends to happen is that when modern authoritarians are considering elections, they have no problem with having elections as long as those elections don't end up with their loss. So they want to have this sweet spot where they have elections, they don't change government, and they also don't attract international flack because of the way they do the election. So the sweet spot for authoritarians is to have an election, control the landscape of the election and therefore the outcome, but have the international community endorse the outcome of the election, or at least not critique it, meaning you get away with rigging the election. In all of these spaces, we are also seeing weak judicial independence. We don't have courts being strong enough to push back against what is happening in this context. We have selective enforcement of laws, and this is particularly when it comes to public order management laws. So whether it's the Public Order Act or the Public Order Management Act in Uganda, the ways in which these laws are applied are selective and primarily used to dissuade the opposition from presenting their viewpoints. You also have a lot of constraints on civil society and the media. These are laws that are applying across the board in the same way. I've seen in countries like Tanzania, during President Magufuli's time, they even worked in such a way that any messages that carried Tundu Lissu's name were not passed through the telecommunications networks. But we've also have the media regulations being employed in such a way that the media self-censors in such a way that they don't present alternative viewpoints or anything other than what the government wants to present. So I'll give an example. When Tundu Lissu came back from exile, for example, to contest the 2020 elections, nobody covered his return to Tanzania because the media was so worried about what would happen to them if they did that. And that's not a Kenyan situation. It's a Ugandan situation, it's a Tanzanian situation. It's something that's happening across the board. So what we are seeing is really, we have elections, there is no change, there's no substantive democracy happening. And so we must ask ourselves, then what do we do with that situation? So let's take a snapshot of Tanzania, because the context in which we are discussing this is Tanzania and borrowing lessons for the other countries. So with Tanzania 2024, we saw two of the main opposition parties, Chadema and Act Wazalendo, not being able to present their candidates. The main reasons that were used to disqualify these candidates were legal, and this is part of why it's very difficult for the international community to come in. These restrictions have a legal veneer. So you have, with Chadema, they're saying you did not sign the Electoral Code of Conduct, and so you're excluded from participating in the election. With Act Wazalendo, they say the candidate did not get his nomination within the time frame that is allowed within the nomination rules, and therefore he's excluded. You have the Attorney General himself being the one who is lodging an objection to his candidature. So the exclusion of political candidates, which is one of the avenues that competitive authoritarian regimes use to exclude the opposition, is done using legal means. And that it makes it very difficult for the international community to come in, because you are actually enforcing your law. So anyone speaking against it is assumed to be violating your sovereignty, and no state wants to come in and appear to be violating the sovereignty of another country. With countries like Uganda, what we're seeing, also with Tanzania, selective prosecution of opposition candidates. So you have treason charges being brought up against particular candidates who are strong. You have arrests, you have restrictions on freedom of assembly. I'll give the example of Uganda with the Public Order Management Act. You have a time frame within which you're allowed to do your campaigns. Your campaigns must close by 6 p.m. You have the delegation by Bobi Wine is trying to move to a campaign venue. The security forces block him from accessing the venue until 5:30 p.m. meaning he has 30 minutes to do his campaign. As soon as he begins to speak at 6 p.m., we disperse the campaigns. So what ends up happening is you have the laws being used in such a way that they restrict alternative viewpoints from being presented. For Burundi, for DRC, we have the use of the law to attempt to not just do political repression, but we are hearing reports, we don't know how true this is. For the DRC, for example, we think that President Tshisekedi is going to be changing the constitution to remove term limits. He has hinted that he's going to be changing the constitution to remove the Western element in the constitution and make it more African. And observers believe it's one of the ways in which he's going to try and seek a third term, even though it's not allowed by law. So in essence, what we are seeing is leaders are not afraid of elections. All leaders are organizing elections. What they're afraid is losing the election, and so they're going to do everything to prevent defeat, including manipulating institutions, manipulating the law, manipulating the procedural rules of the election so that they maintain an appearance of legality while making it impossible for the opposition to organize and mount a serious opposition to the incumbent candidature. So what are we learning from Tanzania? And I know I have just a few minutes, and I'm going to come back in the next round. What are we learning from the Tanzanian elections that other countries need to be wary of? Number one, authoritarianism is always adapting and is always collaborative. What we're seeing in Tanzania is not isolated. What we're seeing in Uganda is not isolated. There is actually a joke that is going around about what happened in Tanzania was quarterfinals. We're expecting semifinals in Uganda and the final in Kenya in 2027. Whatever has worked in Tanzania will be improved on in Uganda, will be perfected in Kenya. So authoritarians borrow strategies, and therefore we must be studying patterns to see what are the strategies that are being used elsewhere and what are the chances that those strategies will be used in Kenya. So when it comes to exclusion of candidates, and we have seen this in Uganda as well, whenever the law is used to exclude candidates, it happens well in advance. Wazalendo, it's used just before the nomination window closes so that there's no opportunity to have a suitable candidate, a replacement candidate coming in. So whenever we are planning around monitoring activities, normally for monitoring, we try and do monitoring well in advance, and we monitor physical infrastructure. We don't focus as much on the legal landscape. And that's one of the things we must start to think about. How are countries changing their laws, compliance rules, the legal architecture to make it impossible for there to be a serious opposition which is being mounted? And as we're doing our monitoring, our observation, how can we look at what does not appear to be straightforward election laws, but which are eventually used to exclude candidates? Because that's one of the strategies that we're seeing being used, political exclusion of the opposition. Number two, institutional capture. All institutions which are capable of mounting an opposition are crippled in the countries where authoritarianism is working. So whether it's the Electoral Commission in countries like Uganda or the judiciary or even INEC in Tanzania, we are seeing the institutions that should provide oversight, that should bulwark against authoritarianism, are being captured or weakened, and therefore they cannot mount any serious opposition to authoritarianism. Thirdly, we must, as I said, look at the timing of the laws that are coming in. What time are the laws being brought in? Whether it's laws on media control, the internet, and we have seen, and I'm sure our colleagues in Uganda will speak about this, journalistic freedom or media freedom, whatever laws are coming in, what is the timing of those laws and what is their correlation with the election? And I'll end on this one and yield the floor back. We must also be wary about last-minute adoption of technological interventions. And I'm sure my colleague from Uganda will speak to this. We've seen a move by the government of Uganda 30 days before the election, 2 days ago. They announced that they have now introduced 15,000 new polling stations way before, just a month before the elections. They have also introduced biometric voter verification technology way before the election, just 30 days before the elections, rather. There's no opportunity for it to be tested. There is no opportunity for observers to acclimatize. With the new polling stations, they haven't done any civic education for people to know how that will affect them. So it's very late in the day for monitors to adjust their capacity for observation, for the opposition to recruit new candidates, because remember, people plan with the polling stations that have been gazetted well in advance. So we must also check what are the administrative things that are being introduced, which are meant to destabilize the opposition and which will end up meaning that nobody can effectively monitor what is being done by the ruling party, and therefore assuring them of victory in the election. Thank you, and back to you, Harrison.
Thank you very much, Luciana. That's a perfect outlay of what we have in the region. I note that you have described the situation we have in the region as competitive authoritarianism under the veneer of law, and given us very vivid examples of why we have a very fragile situation of democracy in the region. Again, if you're just joining us for the webinar at the moment, we are covering the backsliding situation of democracy in the EAC region as part of our Jumuiya webinars here at Jumuiya Law Journal, which is affiliated and part of Kabarak University Law School. I welcome all the colleagues who have joined. I see former registrar of the East African Court of Justice, His Worship Euphnalis Okubo, is here with us. Karibu Sana, His Worship. I also see the current acting registrar of the court, Ms. Christine Mutimura. Karibu Sana, Worship, to the session. Kindly, if you have any questions, feel free to add them onto the session. I see lawyers, students, and many other colleagues who have joined us. Keep noting any questions you might have, and feel free to either add them on the chat as the conversation goes on, or I will give a chance for a few people to voice out their questions. I had initially indicated that Tito will go next, but because of the request and also because of the way Luciana just finished, I think it is a good time to allow Mr. Kiza to come in, because Luciana's conclusion was directly at the situation in Uganda, especially that we have now just had 15,000, you said, new polling stations that have been introduced just a few days to the elections. So I think, even if you can hear me, kindly, you have the floor. You can piggyback on the things Luciana has spoken about and take up any of the other questions that I had laid out at the beginning of the webinar. Karibu Sana.
Okay, that assumes that, well, it assumes many things, but thank you for those remarks. I'm a bit unsettled, but we shall get by.
Okay.
Uganda, we are having death. We are having not a white election that the Minister of Justice had promised, but we are having real death. We are having arrests, several arrests of opposition supporters, opposition campaigners. And this is against the context that there are political prisoners. Not only is one of the leading political prisoners still in prison, Besigye, not only we also have people who were arrested in the last election still in detention. So we have no hope that these people who are being arrested now are going to be released any soon. And this is an election in which Kenyans are not welcome. Bob Njagi, Nicholas Oyo, you remember, were very lucky they knew Uhuru, or Uhuru knew our CDF, but otherwise they would still be in detention. And indeed, Sam Mugumya, a Ugandan, so a Kenyan who knows who stands a better chance than a Ugandan who is just like me, because they will be in detention. That's why Sam Mugumya, who was detained earlier, is now still in detention. So we have a problem of arbitrary detentions and all the problems that she alluded to very succinctly. And we are also staring in the face of the solidarity of the dictatorships. Suluhu Museveni and Uhuru have formed a formidable, devastating, devilish partnership that is injurious to the rights and freedoms of East Africa against electoral democracy. We have to unite as civil society, as lawyers, and as East Africans of Jumuiya to push back against that kind of malady, that kind of cancer that is eating up our democracy. But we also see the role of social media, both in Tanzania and in Uganda, in exposing injustice, in calling out in exposing electoral injustice, governance injustice, and human rights violation. So the role of social media, the role of technology is very important, but it can also be serve contrary on the contrary scripts, because we have biometric machines which no one knows how to use. And we know that Facebook is still closed in Uganda, and more social media platforms will be closed in Uganda as we edge towards the counting. So someone says that it doesn't matter the number, but what matters is who counts. And we are seeing Museveni doing the counting already, and we'll do the counting as Uhuru did the counting, and she has her own calculation. These days, they give themselves right to the percentages. We don't know what percentage Museveni is going to give himself. He's not going to be as outrageous as Suruhu, but you can be sure he's going to manufacture a result, and we may not go the Tanzanian way, we will not go the Tanzanian way, but you don't know what adverse repercussions that may bring. And unless there is a question, I think for me, that's a summary I can do for now.
Thank you so much, Mr. Kiza, for that very short, succinct, and very well put presentation that paints the situation that is currently obtaining in Uganda quite vividly, that there are continuing arrests, continuing killings of opposition leader. The leading political figure in Uganda, opposition figure, Dr. Besigye, is still in prison, and this is very similar to the situation that was obtaining in Tanzania. Individuals are arrested, even individuals from Kenya, like we have the two activists that you've mentioned. So it's not strange, therefore, that you say there seems to be like a sense of a solidarity of authoritarianism or dictatorships of sorts that is taking place in the region, which, as we have said, is not a situation that the rule of law, human rights, and desire of well-working democratic region speaks towards to. And this goes, in my view, against the very fundamental and foundational requirements of the EAC Community Treaty. I thank you, Mr. Kiza. I've noted that you might step out at some point. Please just inform me before you step out. But thank you so much for that presentation and giving us a picture there of what is happening. I want to pass on the floor to Mr. Tito Magoti, who can pick up on some of these issues that have been mentioned, covering what has happened in Tanzania and what we are possibly witnessing in Uganda at the moment, and what is going to happen in the future. What do you think about some of these questions? What are the lessons that we can learn? What are the challenges that we can deal with? And possibly, if you can also touch on this issue of what can the EAC organs do, or how have they failed on acting on this? I know that when I read the EAC Election Observation Mission report of the Tanzanian election and contrasted it with the SADC one, it was as if, they were observing two different and separate elections. So, Tito, you have the floor. Karibu sana.
Asante sana Mwalimu Harrison and colleagues. Also great to see familiar faces and names on this call. Yes, it could be much of what colleagues said, because also it goes to the reality that we are siblings, we share history, we share territories, we relate as much, which is why our governance architecture is similar, or there's a tendency of borrowing tendencies and tactics that would work in a way to keep regimes alive. So for the case of Tanzania, Um, one, Tanzanians are trying to rewrite the political culture. And I can trace back in history. You know, we read about how Tanzania supported liberation movements across Africa. So one would think that maybe Mwalimu is rather rejuvenating himself in Tanzania. Mwalimu is resurrected through the descendants. And for me, I think it's human nature not to be uncomfortable and find it okay. Because the endurance that we had to go through, I mean, the difficulties, the hardship that we had to endure for the longest period had now materialized into a pressure release. So what happened was not surprising, especially for watchers of Tanzanian politics, but very much surprising even for the neighbors, because they thought these guys don't have much of what we experience. And you would look at it in all parameters, through all parameters, that it started as it started when people were really sidelined from governance, in a way that now institutions of justice does not work or respond to the initial purposes, the primary purposes. You think about a parliament, for example. In 2020, we had a 99% ruling party CCM members in the parliament. It is a similar experience that we now have. Now we have, you would say, probably 100%. Excuse me. So now I would say we have 100% CCM member parliament, and this means that if the parliament is not of the people, or is not reflecting the will of the people, then you're blocking legitimate voices and checks of the government. But also would speak about institutions of justice like the judiciary. So who goes to the judiciary to seek justice in Tanzania? It means these people are burning within it, or they don't have faith in the justice system. And then you would also look into crackdown into the alternative voices, including civil society organizations, the media, human rights defenders, and then the entire community through their political representatives, the opposition, through use of these tactics like jailing. My sister Luciana said it very eloquently. Use of repressive laws, and then attack of the people whenever they try to convene, including convening online. So then you are bound to have a society that is now going to fight for its survival. But no, we are human beings. We are accustomed to speaking, accustomed to developing, and we cannot develop in such a setting. So what does it mean in terms of the future of governance, or the future of political dispensation in the region? For me, I would say three things. One, the fact that there's an awakening amongst the people, that now the people, at least they know what they want, even if they may not get it now, but they know what they want, and they're expressing it in a way that they think it works, because of the failures of the ballot paper to give you a result that you want. At least you will resort to expressing anger and frustration in a way that is unpopular. Two, you said it also exposes holes in our regional governance architecture. For example, you said the mismatch between what the EAC saw, the SADC, and more other voices are coming out. Last night we saw a statement from the president of Ghana. You know, I think it's the first time in a while that the sitting president is now at least trying to come through in a language that is not fashionable, saying that Tanzania has to regroup. And the statement is very succinct in a way that it's not a mere podium address. As you know, you would look at what Hichilema did during the swearing-in ceremony in the Islam, and then he claims to have been misquoted. But at least the president of Ghana put in writing, and then you can see the tonation that probably, you know, we are seeing more holes, especially with those who claim to be progressive, yet they endorse dictatorship. We do not hope. I mean, we don't have much hope in these other institutions, including the EAC. Others call it a club of elders, others a club of elites. I saw a clip trending of Julius Malema giving his own share of opinion about the relevance of the African Union and more after the AUC chair endorsing Samia Suluhu. So we may not necessarily, I mean, for us from where we sit, we don't necessarily see the importance of these institutions, but if we need them, now we need to look into how to make them work instead of expecting them respond or react to our situations. So I shouldn't speak a lot because I understand you're constrained with time. But for me, I would look at the future of our political dispensations in East Africa in a way that the people will eventually win. The people will eventually win, especially if we want the government of the people properly so-called. Unless if the people give in, and then we're going to have another, you know, another conception of the government, not the government that we read in the books. So it all rests on the people, and it remains to be seen how far the people can pursue their democratic rights. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Tito, for that, for those very erudite introductory remarks about the situation in Tanzania. I note one of the themes that you have taken that had not been taken previously is this idea that the people of Tanzania want to rewrite their political culture. They want to take things into their own hands and try to see whether there can be changes that can improve the democratic governance within Tanzania. So you call there's an awakening among the people. And you could also link this to the Gen Z protests that have not only taken place in Kenya, but have taken place in other parts of the world. And the question some people have asked is, how can this pressure by the people be kept up when we have sometimes regional elections that take place after 4 years? Then people tend to say, oh, things cool down. Possibly people tend to forget. And so how can the people keep up on their awakening momentum in such a way that there's always deep pressure for the government? That's what came to mind as you are making your presentations and invoking, you know, Mwalimu Julius Nyerere and the kind of culture he would have built, and what would he say about how Tanzania has turned out today? In a deep sense, it had been thought in the region that Tanzania was the haven of peace, that it couldn't, if it went wrong in Tanzania, it really is bad. And so this 2025 election has some sort of, you know, jolted our imagination, jolted our thinking, and made some of us think, you know, was it all just tenuous, you know, peace, or wasn't it, or is it an idea where there's never been justice anyway? So this is just a manifestation of the same. So I would then invite my good friend and brother, Dr. Owiso, to pick up this conversation from here. There are a number of themes that have emerged. There are a number of issues that have been raised. So there is so much to think about based on what already is on the table, and you can possibly pick it up from whichever direction you would love the conversation to take. Karibu sana daktari.
Can I be heard? Good.
Yes.
Asante sana Bwana Harrison. Sikupewa mwelekeo kuhusu lugha, so acha nianze na Kiswahili, lakini nitaendelea kwa Kiingereza.
Sikujua unakifahamu Kiswahili vizuri.
Sikupewa mwelekeo, but I'll take liberties.
Please do.
Acha nianze hivi. What should I say? Ukikashfiwa na majangili kama hawa marais wetu, tuseme kama Ruto, ndugu wangu, jua wewe umepotea kabisa. And that is the scenario that we find ourselves in today as we discuss Tanzania. Because tukiangalia juzi, miliona Suluhu alikashfiwa na watu kama William Ruto, for instance. Na William Ruto mwenyewe, mwaka jana na mwaka huu, ameua watoto wengi sana. Sasa ukikashfiwa na watu kama William Ruto, jua dadangu, ama kakangu, una shida. And that is precisely why we're here today, discussing a problem. And I like, there's a statement you made, Harrison, a few minutes ago, that there was always this perception that it could never go wrong in Tanzania. And if it did, then that is when you know that we do have a problem. And I do agree with that statement to some extent. But allow me to recall and just start with an observation I've sort of made about, I would call them independence movements or liberation movements, CCM being one of them. And it's always, to me, quite insightful to observe how veteran members and supporters of these movements, such as the CCM and the ANC and, let's say, ZANU-PF, that is, older generations, how they react to changes in time and development in the political sphere and the governance sphere, right? So they teach us a lot about, ideology, about governance, about loyalty, and about, principled political participation. And, one key indicator that an independence or liberation movement or party has lost its way completely, at least from where I sit, is how the older generation of its followers would react to outright bad manners. And I come to this conversation from a point of quite a number of the older members of my own family have been, for a very long time, very ardent supporters of CCM. And for quite a while, they've voted CCM. But I've observed a pattern in the last maybe 6, probably to 8 years up till now, a pattern of disenfranchisement and disappointment in this particular group. And my observation is that these movements enjoy deep loyalty and trust amongst the older generation, and that is true. But it's not a sort of blind loyalty. It's loyalty and trust that is dependent on those movements, including, CCM sticking to what these generations call its fundamental or foundational principles. Not just the theory of it, but also, the practice of it. And to me, I would call those, in the context of CCM, I would call those the Nyerere principles, which to me are sort of difficult to delink from the CCM principles. So that is the basis of, the older generation's loyalty to these movements. But when the movement goes completely bonkers, the way the CCM has done, up to, the run up to the 2025 elections, this generation sort of, not out of, probably out of nostalgia or, for what was, but also hesitation to throw away the entire party, throw away the baby with the bathwater and to embrace what to them is unknown. Out of probably that, they may not necessarily vote for the opposition, because that's quite unlikely. They have those very deep loyalties and connections to this movement, but they will sit it out. And the moment you find as a political party or a movement, independence movement, that your core support base, going back generations, sits out an election, they're neither voting for the opposition, but they're not voting for you either. That is when you know you have a problem. And we've seen this with the African National Congress in South Africa. That's when the rain started beating ZANU-PF in Zimbabwe. And that's also when the rain started beating CCM, not today, not yesterday, but probably, around Magufuli times. And that to me, is a very powerful sign of the beginning of the end of the movement. And here I would say it is a very powerful sign to me of the beginning of the end of CCM in the Tanzanian context. Right? And, you know, as I said, I've observed this in older members of my family. There's no more powerful indicator that a movement has lost its way when, you know, the ordinary people who have for decades believed in that party and in its ideology sit back and say, you know, mambo haya ni mageni kwetu, hatuyaelewi na tutambui chama chetu. And that is where CCM got in 2025. But it was a journey. We didn't wake up in 2025 and Tanzania happened. No. It is a journey and it is a pattern, and I believe the previous speakers have alluded to this. It is a journey, it's a pattern, and it's not a journey and a pattern that is isolated or restricted or unique to Tanzania. It is a journey and a pattern that we see across the region, across the community. You look at Uganda, you look at Kenya, you look at Rwanda, you look at Burundi, pretty much everybody in the region. It is a pattern that is first characterized by first trying to destroy, you know, all the essential conditions for having a meaningful democratic process. And that begins long before the act of elections. It begins by, you know, banning political parties, as we've seen in Uganda, in Tanzania, for instance, making it very difficult for political parties or candidates to actually campaign, sending some of them to jail, you know, Uganda and Tanzania quite on the spot for this, and, you know, weakening the electoral management body, the EMB. I think we have a bit of a problem with that in Kenya. Then after you have done that, you then stage sort of a semblance of an election, something that looks like it, and that is what we had, you know, the other day in Tanzania. So it is a process that begins somewhere. It is very carefully calibrated, step by step. And I always, somebody once told me when I was much younger, and I didn't quite understand it back then, but now I quite agree, that dictators are often not stupid people. Dictators are often some of the smartest people we have around. The difference is they deploy their smarts towards not good causes, but towards causes such as, you know, dictatorship. So they are very calculated, destroying all those building blocks of a democracy systematically, step by step, weakening laws. For instance, there's, you know, across the region, we also have now laws that relate to the cyberspace being systematically changed or systematically tampered with, because, and the reason for that is because in today's democratic space, and whatever space, technology plays a significant role in it. And it's sort of a way for us to galvanize as a people, for us to mobilize, galvanize, you know, teach ourselves and basically be informed. So that is the first point. You know, we just call it a baraza. That today is our baraza. So if you can limit our baraza, or our access to a baraza, our access to spaces and platforms that we can, you know, convene at and have conversations around, then you have, of course, struck a blow to democracy. And they're very good at that. We see cyber crimes laws used across the region in Kenya, in Uganda, in Tanzania to first stifle dissent. And also then to shut down platforms, or at least to attempt to shut down platforms. Some courts in the region are fighting back. I believe the Kenyan courts are fighting back, but there's just so much they can do. And of course, also this also brings in something I wanted to mention, that yes, we castigate our governments for these particular moves and issues, but there are also other entities that are complicit in them. And here I'm thinking of big tech companies, for instance, in stifling or reducing this political space, especially in the digital space. Tech companies are complicit. I believe we all know Maria Sehai Serungi. I believe her social media platforms are still either restricted or blocked today. And they were not blocked because the Tanzanian government has access to those accounts. They were blocked because the Tanzanian government can simply have a conversation with big tech companies and say, this particular person, we don't like whatever they're posting, therefore restrict or either block this. And that is a pattern that is sweeping across the region. But then what do we do about it? And that then takes me back to an issue I had with the framing of this, not the framing of the conversation per se, but the title. When we talked about backsliding of democracy, the question I asked myself is, where are we backsliding to? I mean, backsliding implies that we were in a good place at some point, and now we are regressing and going back. But then the question I'll throw back to everybody is, were we ever in a good place? Are we ever in a good place, or are we simply retooling bad manners? We've always had the bad manners. We're just retooling it to make it look better. And those are the questions that have been playing on my mind. But that, nonetheless, that said, I believe, not to be too much of a pessimist, I believe that there's a lot of power in the collective. And what gives me some sort of hope is that despite what's been happening across the region in the past few years, we've also seen an awakening of solidarity across the community. Not solidarity at the point, at the position or the point of leadership or political leadership and our politicians and all that. Those fellows will always rejoice in us being disintegrated. But solidarity at a people position, at a people level. So when stuff happens, let's say what happened in Tanzania and what's happening in Tanzania, there's a lot of conversation around across the community of citizens of the community standing in solidarity with one another and seeing what can we do in this respect in terms of human rights, in terms of accountability, and in terms of that. And I believe President Suluhu, I hesitate to call her president, but she is our I'm both Tanzanian and Kenyan, so she's my president, I would imagine. But the other day she took the stand and she was addressing a bunch of elders somewhere, and the first stone she cast was the neighbors. It's always somebody else. But she was not talking about somebody else. She was not saying, okay, it's President Ruto who is doing this to me, or it's President Museveni who is doing this to me. No, I believe she was talking about the people of these countries. She was mad that the people of Kenya, the people of Uganda, and across the community were trying to have some sort of solidarity with the people of Tanzania. And that to me gives me a lot of hope, because I believe we have the power, we have the capability, and we have the tools to push back. Dictators are smart. They probably have the monopoly of violence, but we didn't get here as a human race, right? We didn't get here as a human race by simply capitulating. If our forebears had done that, we would probably still be either in chains or colonized. So I still have a lot of faith in the ability of the people of Jumuiya, not our leaders, but the people of Jumuiya, to push back against this. I see Harrison has cautioned me against time, and I apologize for rambling on for too long. I'll stop here, and if there's anything else, I'll probably take it up later on.
No, it's okay, Daktari. I was just reminding you, you will still have another go at it. I like most of the points that you have raised. There's the weakening of electoral management bodies. There are steps towards rigging of these elections, which include, the incursion of cybersecurity laws that is happening across the region. And one thing that we had not mentioned previously that I find very interesting is that other entities are complicit, that big tech and data companies are complicit in this process. They're not just bystanders. They're not just, the quintessential post office where, a letter only passes through. They are involved in this stifling of democracy. I also love that you said, what do we do? And just like Tito, you say, we only have ourselves. No one will come to rescue us in the region. We, the people, have to resist. We have to awaken the power of solidarity. We have to speak out against these regressions. I also love that you said, you only backslide if you had made some progress, and you're wondering whether we had made any progress. So I find that interesting. A couple of colleagues from Uganda have said we should minimize the use of the language of Kiswahili, which is okay. I noticed that Museveni recently has encouraged us himself to all of us take up Kiswahili for the sake of our brothers who are now in the regions. Ugandans should have already taken it up. I know that we challenge them every day, and they say they will do it. It's just that they don't want to do it. But I also understand the language has some historical baggage in Uganda, so I don't want to open a can of worms. Ladies and gentlemen, if you have just joined us, we have been covering the situation of democracy within the East African Community region. This is Jumuiya Journal, an affiliate journal and part of Kabarak University Law School. We tend to pride ourselves as being one of, or maybe the leading institution that is trying to take regional issues that relate to law, rule of law within the East African community very seriously and at the forefront. I want to acknowledge some of the people who I see have joined this discussion, including our very own Dean of Law, Professor John Osogo Ambani. Karibu sana, Dean. I hope you are enjoying the conversation. I see some of the very good students from the university who have also joined the conversations. Liberty Mshindi, who's my student, Karibu sana. Feel acknowledged. I see some who have finished, like Rita Butit, and all other people who have joined from the different parts of the community, from different sectors of the East African communities. Welcome to this conversation. I hope you're enjoying it. I want to move to the second part of the conversation before I open it for Q&A. I noticed that I have not yet received any questions on the chat box, and I would like to start encouraging us to write any questions or any comments we have on the chat box, so that when the time comes, we are going to deal with it. I want to circle back to Luciana. From some of the things that you had mentioned, I would love to also hear your views of what Tito and Owisha said. What can we do? But in addition to that, you already said there is institutional capture. It seems to me as if you're saying the institutional capture has taken place at the domestic level. Is it also true or accurate to say that there has been an institutional capture at the regional level? Are the organs of the community capable of dealing with this, or are they appendages of the authoritarian governments at the domestic level, and therefore we shouldn't expect them to do much? And this might possibly be true for the East African community, as it is for the African Union and for the other community organs. What would be some of your views about this, in addition to this question of election observation, which I know that you are very much interested in? For this round, I will ask you to take a maximum of 6 minutes, so that then we can also have the other colleagues go on the second round before I quickly open it up for Q&A. So, Luciana, you have the floor.
Thank you, Harrison. Let me start by echoing what Owiso has said about perceptions. I think he made a fantastic point about the perception that Tanzania was the paragon of democratization. And I think this goes to just the power of narratives. The feeling that if we don't see an outright breakout of violence or breakdown of systems, then we assume that all is well. But I think it points to the power of fusing state machinery, dominant political party, and state ideology, and what impact that has on the capacity of a people to be dissatisfied with a regime. One of the things that I think we take for granted is that Tanzania has never had any other political party in power. So you have a political party that has everything to lose whenever it goes into an election. And then there's a fusion of that. I know we speak about Mwalimu Nyerere in the glossiest of terms, but the truth of the matter is a lot of the authoritarian practices we see now were instituted by Mwalimu and were carried forward by successive presidents. And so what we are seeing as the tension between the ruling party and the opposition party is all of these political parties were compelled to remain loyal to the ruling party. And now as money began to enter the space and the political and the economic elites expanded, there was less capacity to constrain them within the political party. And that's why you have so many factions of the opposition breaking out. So what you had was, for a long time, just as Owiso was saying, there was loyalty to the political party because of sentiment, because Tanzanians were taught to be good citizens and obedient citizens, and that meant we don't question the government. But that was good for a while until you realize this government is not delivering on any of its economic agenda. And then now you realize, hey, we need something else. We need a different approach. And that's the same thing that we saw in Kenya, and I'm sure it's the same thing that's happening in Uganda. We can tolerate you as a dominant political party if you address our standard of living. The day we stop receiving anything from you is the day we say, this is not working. And that's, I think, part of what has pushed to the breaking point that we have seen in the recent past. So I think the point I want to make is we need to understand the power of a dominant narrative and the power of a dominant political party that has fused state ideology with party machinery and the capacity to repress any form of opposition, both within its ranks and externally. To your point about institutional capture, I think it's clear, and I'll go back again to what you said earlier about the differences between the EAC observation report and the SADC report. The praise that came out of the EAC report, congratulating the Tanzania for all the good things they did, and they pointed to things that were neither here nor there, and not unimportant, but didn't really go to the core of the issue. So accessibility of polling stations was fantastic. They said, yeah, people were able to access polling stations. They were opened and closed early. They didn't speak anything about turnout. They themselves were not able to access the National Tallying Center, and they didn't flag that as an issue. They just said, we didn't know the location of the National Tallying Center, so we didn't go. I mean, what kind of observation does not go to the National Tallying Center? Which then tells you, again, going back to the issue of solidarity of authoritarians, there is no way I'm going to point a finger at you if I'm expecting to use the same tactics that you have used in my election. And that's the weakness that we have. Good thing I like about what has come from the president of Ghana, and I'm glad Tito brought it up, is whenever other countries have brought up issues to do with elections, it has primarily been the West, because of course it's the West that invests a lot in election observation missions. When an African president, and we saw this with former president of Botswana as well, speaking out against the atrocities, when business elite and governance experts like Mo Ibrahim speak out on these things, who are African, when the president of Ghana speaks out on these questions, when the usual diatribe, the usual response of it's the West speaking out against this cannot fly. Now it's Africans calling Africans to order. And I think the reprieve that we might have, even where our regional institutional mechanisms are weak, is where other African leaders or former African leaders or influential leaders on the continent speak out. The Tanzanian president can no longer get away with saying, these people who are calling us out, they also have problems in their own countries. Africans are now telling Africans, we have bad manners and we must now fix it. So I think that's a positive thing that is coming out from other leaders within the continent, even where the EAC region is not very strong on calling out those things. Number two, in as much as institutions are not strong, and we saw this with INEC, we've seen this with the Electoral Commission of Uganda, which is fused with the judiciary. So there's all questions of separation of powers. We have hope in certain mechanisms, and I think we must not lose heart when we think about Kenya as a context. We have problems. Let's admit Kenya has many problems. Political party dominance is a problem that we must watch out for 2024. But for all of its problems, the judiciary has remained a bastion, a bulwark against this authoritarian encroachment. And one of the things that we must think about, even as we go into 2027, how do we insulate institutions like the judiciary from the capture that we have seen with other institutions? Whereas we have problems with our judicial structure, and there are instances where we felt let down by the judiciary, for example, with the impeachment of the former deputy president. The truth of the matter is there are men and women who are doing their best to make sure that the judiciary is an institution that can be spoken to. So there are different contextual issues. There are things that have gone wrong, like with the solidarity of authoritarians, but there are still opportunities with institutions like the judiciary, and we have seen borrowing of precedents happening in other jurisdictions. You will remember Malawi citing the Kenyan situation to also annul their own election. So we must not give up on institutions that are working. We must think about how do we insulate them from pressure. Finally, I want to echo what was already said about the solidarity of citizens. When you see President Museveni telling Larry Madowo, don't come to reports about our Ugandan election, it tells you that when Kenyan journalists stand with Tanzania and when they stand with Uganda, these dictators are listening, they are concerned because they know that the clout that these influential personalities have globally. Remember, I began by saying authoritarians have no problem with elections. They just want to get away with rigging and not get any backlash. If there's a possibility of getting backlash, and we've seen what has happened with Tanzania and the worry about aid not coming into the country, it gets them to think twice. And that's what we want. We may not get a change overnight, but if authoritarians are thinking twice about their strategies, we are making traction. And what we need to do is start celebrating wins, even as we look to the larger picture. We may not win the war in one day, but every step that we win, every battle that we win is important. And for me, President Museveni signaling to Madowo, you're not welcome, don't speak about our context, is saying we are nervous. And that nervousness is not a small thing. And I think it's something to be celebrated. Let me yield the floor back to you, Harrison.
Thank you so much. I think you've made it very clear about what we need to do, about how we need, at least within the country of Kenya, to protect the judiciary, because you called it the bulwark, actually the last remaining bulwark against authoritarianism, the solidarity of citizens, the job of journalists. And I see we have some journalists who have joined us in here. We appreciate their role. They play an important role that can protect or can push away these authoritarian tendencies. I want to sort of move to Tito. It seems to me as if, and I don't know whether this is a good question for you or any of the other colleagues will at some point come back to it. The focus has now just become, Tanzania. The focus has now just become Uganda because it's happening. I know Luciana mentioned DRC and the problems that are arising there, but I know there are serious challenges and continuing in Somalia. I know we have had close to the same questions in Rwanda. I know we have had the same kinds of concerns in Burundi. At least in my lifetime, and I'm a pretty young human being, though my students who are Gen Zs tend to think otherwise. The I was concerned about that. We take possibly pick up on some of these concerns and possibly hear what you have to say. And I also welcome some of the colleagues who have said I've done. I see Dr. and many of us here. So karibu sana mwalimu.
Thank you so much. Asante sana. So you asked two questions that I don't have the right answer. I have a perspective. Well, the first question is very important. Is a very angle to reflect on, collect. What is it that we do when we finish elections? Where do we go? I remember President Full when he suspended political rallies. I think so. Let me bring you development. This is what he was implying, that so he wanted to literally disengage in governance and let him deliver. So, political rallies, civil society meetings, consultation, civic engagements would be deemed as disrupting the president and his good intention. He grew drastically as a dictator. I keep trying to tell people not to use the word benevolent because it serves no purpose, because you may end up having benevolent, rapist, benevolent, whatever. So Magufuli grew up as a dictator because he was able to do that. We allowed him to to deliver development, if you like. That what is happening, what happens in Congo, in Somalia, in Uganda, probably in Kenya as well, might be as a result of the sentiment that where do people go after voting? What are they doing for the region? Are they participating in governance? Do they have a of governance that putting the government in constant checks? So for me, it would be a question of how we relate, especially after voting. I don't know what Kenyans are doing now. Up to 2027, and maybe worries that we might drift into but we should rather be asking that what are we doing to our governance architecture work in a way that it reflects our collective good. Yeah, the second question, I would say that there was no election in Tanzania. That answers, to all these other questions. How was the voting process go? How did they count such a massive turnout in Sulu's statistics? Because 38 million is a massive turnout. You do not have a technology that enables you to do the tallying process. You didn't have internet. Communication was blocked in the middle of a mandatory illegal curfew and illegal lockdown. So you would wonder how the counting went, but sentiment is that there was no election, which is why it's not even easy to trace the irregularities so-called. But also, I think the ruling elite was so obsessed in babysitting the incumbent that they forgot to take cognizance of all these other questions that would arise. For instance, there's people storming stations, running with ballot boxes and ballot papers, which really scared people from just turning out to vote. We saw other cases. I mean, we saw critical cases of people expressing anger, telling people over social media that if you show us the ink, because the regime apologists posted pictures early in the morning showing that I voted, there was election. Other people say that tutakukata hicho kidole tukikukuta una win tutakukata hicho kidole. So I would say people are scared.
You need to translate that. You need to translate that for someone who doesn't know what it means.
Oh, I'm sorry. I saw Brother Philip Kaba decrying that there is limited. So kukata kidole is we'll cut your finger if we see validation. You're validating the regime that we think is repressive and the process that is shambolic. So if we find your finger with ink, brutal, but I'm alluding to it as a measure that also scared people. Presence and the police presence in major cities. Also, in a way, electoral process did not occur per the standards, and some of them observers alluded to that. So for me, I would not even question how the voting went. The counting was all these other irregularities. As I feel, on something real quick. The perception that Mwalimu Owiso and my sister Tiana said that Tanzania has peaceful, rather Tanzania was a more lenient cases compared to other countries. It could have been true because people would vote and go back home decrying as others would try to vote, but you cannot challenge the outcome of the presidential election. But I think it was the circumstance. There's a context that was not clear enough outside Tanzania. And a lot of people started getting about Tanzania when we had transnational repression, taking our brother from Kenya, Boniface Mwangi, is when people started looking at Tanzania with a little bit of caution. If they can do this to people whose profiles are everywhere, it means they're doing a lot more to people. And for me who have been in places like prison, I would tell the magnitude of the use of these authoritarian tendencies, which are policy brutality against legitimate voices of democracy. So I would say we did not tell our story quite clear in the region. Maybe the change of government or the change of personalities in the after every 5 or 10 years also sent a message that maybe we're democratic, but we're a replica of Uganda. The only difference is that they have one general party, and it's just a change of personalities, which also speaks to what is happening in Uganda. They have had that guy for like forever. Yeah, and so it's that we didn't tell our story quite clear. And maybe the recent development might well help to craft the story of East Africa in a more deserving language that will also reflect the solutions needed to address some of these governance challenges. Asante sana, Harris.
Karibu sana, Tito. I think you have done a really good job also of giving us the a further analysis of the tensions and the title of this webinar was Lessons from 2025 Tanzanian election. So you can imagine the idea that we want to learn so next time you're saying, we should rephrase our topic more carefully so that we capture. But this is partly what we wanted to capture, and thank you for mentioning that.
But
Yeah.
Harris, I remember some analysts as early as a week or a month before the exercise, they called it clearly a coronation exercise.
Yeah.
So people are ahead of time in terms of predicting. Thanks.
Yeah, I guess you could see, and Luciana has said, elections are not stolen on the election date. I think Owiso also mentioned this. Elections are stolen way before, so that it is very easy, even a year or 6 months before the election, to tell whether there's going to be an election that is going to take place or not. And I think some people have already called the shots for Uganda. We are waiting for a coronation. We're not waiting for an election as such. I think that is what Iran, who I think has already stepped out, would have said. Also, as you give your second round and your final round of thoughts, I want to hear your views about what Luciana said. Luciana said that we have romanticized Mwalimu Julius Nyerere. We have romanticized, and we said there's certain principles that he set out, and that he was a bastion of democracy. And Luciana is saying that history needs to be revisited and revised. that most of the authoritarian tension or issues that we are seeing today were actually rooted within his governance. And therefore, you could trace what we are seeing in 2025 to Nyerere. I would like to hear your views on that. This I really want to hear. The second, the second question I have for you is the tension between development and authoritarianism. And this came from Tito's point of view. He said, after elections, the Tanzanians are told, let's go back to work, let's leave politics. And this is also something we get, what we have been told in Kenya before, yeah? Accept and move on was once a slogan, you know. The elections are over, accept and move on. We need to develop the country. In other countries, I've been told, you know, you don't talk so much about electoral injustice or electoral processes because you're told the streets are clean, we are doing well economically. Why would you be complaining about small matters such as, you know, an election? I would love to hear your views about that tension between economic development and authoritarian governance.
Thank you, Harrison. On the first, just as an anecdote, I do agree with Tito Magoti's statement that there was no election, and the reason I say that is 2 days before elections, I spoke to my mother, who has voted religiously since the beginning of time. I asked her if she's going to vote, and then she said in Swahili, uchaguzi gani, meaning what election, and that was 2 days before election. So those who were in the know knew. Those who had eyes knew there was not going to be an election. It was quite obvious. But on to the question that you asked, and the first one, I must confess that I'm one of those fellows who have a lot of respect for Mwalimu Nyerere. I do have a lot of respect for the man, because the reason I say that is because he was one of those leaders, at least of his time, who you could clearly see had a vision and, you know, had the interests of the people at the heart of most of the things he did. But I would say that much like, you know, with many things, Mwalimu Nyerere was also was a function or a product of his own self-belief. He believed so much in himself, which is not a bad thing. But he believed so much in himself to the extent that I think at some point he sort of might have mistaken let me rephrase that. I'm trying to rephrase it in my head. He must have come to a point where he believed that he's the only person who knew what was good for the masses. So in the end, he did a lot of good, particularly in terms of, you know, ideologically, in terms of unity, and he had good ideas for the country. But where I would fault Nyerere is in execution, because, you know, you have all these grand plans, but if you get to a point where you have these grand plans, but you tend to believe that you're the only person who can deliver it, who can actually have a vision on behalf of everybody else, you may falter, right? So yes, I agree with Luciana that the foundation of quite a number of the things that we see today in terms of democratic backsliding were laid during Nyerere's time. Nyerere family believed, yes, that, you know, development, ujamaa, and, you know, democracy could be achieved in a one-party system, and that is something that I fundamentally disagree with. He had his reasons for it, but it was fundamentally flawed. So the mistakes he made were, I would say, a consequence of somebody who tried to do good. He was someone who tried to do good, but then, of course, became a victim of his own self-belief. But that said, I still have a lot of respect for the man, and I'll finish that thought with a statement that he made, if I could fish it up, a statement that Nyerere made, and there's a piece that is it Ayaga Max, a very promising law student, published yesterday in the platform, and he started with it, and Nyerere said this in Kiswahili. I'll try and translate it for our friend Karugaba later. Ukiona serikali ambayo haitaki kukosolewa, tambua kuwa hiyo ni serikali, sio serikali nzuri. Serikali inayokataa kusikiza sauti za watu wake inaelekea kwenye udikteta. Maana demokrasia ni sauti ya wananchi, si amri ya viongozi. So basically what he was saying is, if you see a government that does not want to be called to order, that is a government that is sliding towards a dictatorship. So that, to me, summarizes what Nyerere was. Nyerere is somebody who believed in democracy, but perhaps did not necessarily go about it in all the good ways that we imagine we should go about democracy. So that is perhaps all I could say about Nyerere. But yes, certainly most of the things that we see now can be traced back to his time. And as Tito Magoti said, just because there wasn't too much noise coming from Tanzania doesn't mean that it's always been all blissful. Certainly better on some other metrics, but it hasn't always been so blissful. So it's not been, so what we saw in 2025 in this election was not an isolated incident. It had been long coming for those who bothered to look a bit deeply. Development and authoritarianism. What is development? And for someone to ask that question of, should we be so focused on democracy at the expense of development and all that? To me, there's a fundamental error or mistake in that question. Why? Because that implies to me that you're proceeding from a fundamentally flawed understanding of what development is. Because development, to me, has to have the word human in it. Human development. Development for the betterment of, of the lot of the human beings, basically, of our lot. So if you're saying we're going to do development and stifle your democratic rights, who are you doing this development for? And what exactly is it? Because development, to me, are those things we do as a collective for the betterment of us as a collective. So if you're going to build roads for me, and I can't even question how much you're spending on those roads, of what good is it? If you're going to clean my streets, but I'm not going to question who got the contract for cleaning that street, which is probably your son or daughter or somewhere, then of what benefit is it to me? Right? So to me, development is the collective action that makes our lives better. And I would not want to imagine a situation where we have shiny roads, but I can go to prison for demanding somebody to pay me my debt because they're in government. We have shiny roads, but I cannot exercise my right to decide who gets to build that road, in the sense I cannot cast a vote to decide who gets to govern me, because you see the function of the decisions made by government in terms of infrastructural development and other development are made by leaders that we ideally choose. So if I cannot choose the leaders who are going to make these fundamental decisions for us, then of what use is that development? Do we even call it development? So I'll throw it back to you, Harrison. What is your understanding of development? Because from where I sit, development is not development if it doesn't have the word human to it. If it is not human development, it is not development. It's an entirely different thing. And that is why I also have a fundamental problem with the term benevolent dictatorship. That is a misnomer. You cannot have a dictator who is at the same time benevolent. That is a misnomer, and it is rubbish. So it is not an either-or situation. You cannot say that human rights can be divorced from development. It is one and the same thing. You can't have one and not the other. It's not an either, and it is not an either-or situation. That is all I'm going to say about that. And I see you smiling, Harrison, because we are going to have some other conversations after this. But for the sake of my public persona, I will stop there for now.
Thanks so much, Dr. Today I have the privilege of saying I'm just a moderator. I ask questions, so it's not like when we normally have conversations that you throw questions back at me. Today I'm saying I'm the ones asking the questions. The way journalists, when they do interviews, they say, no, you can't ask me questions. I am the one who's asking the questions today. But I get your point, and I really understand the indivisibility points that you've made. I want to take this opportunity to democratize this conversation a bit. We still have about 20 minutes before we can close it. I don't want to close it without giving an opportunity to the members who have taken their very important time from different parts of the region and of the world to join the conversation. I want to just take a look. I already see one hand up. Is there anyone in the audience who might have a question and they're still questioning whether this is the time? Maybe you want to put your hand now, because I would love to take a number of them together. Then we can see whether we will have any other time. I see my good friend Alvin Kubaso has his hand up. Do we have any other questions, any other concerns, something that you thought was covered and you would like a clarification on, or even comments? Okay. So for now, I only see, okay. So I see Philip Karugaba and Alvin. You can add them onto this side. We will take those two for now. and then allow the panelists to speak to them. And if there is any other, if we have time remaining, we might take another round, though I'm not very sure. So Alvin, you have the floor. You can make your commentary or your question.
Thank you so much, Dr. Kindly confirm you can hear me.
Yes, loud and clear.
Fantastic. So I just wanted to send in a comment in relation to the conversation that we are having, and especially I've liked the insights from Ms. Luciana. And what I'd like to say is, I also think we are taking it away from the gravity rather when we say that it's authoritarianism, because the problem with that is you and I as legal practitioners, as loosely in this context, elites, we understand what that means. But to the normal person who this information is supposed to get, when you use the word authoritarian, then it's like, so it's not a dictatorship. So it's so, I mean, I can live with that. So, and I think it's important that it is called for what it is, because Daktari, and here I'd like to quote you, one of the things that swayed me your way in as far as being this college, you said that we call things as they are so that we don't, flatter them. And that's my concern with us calling this authoritarianism, because as is, it's a dictatorship. It is a dictatorship that's just metamorphosized in light of the new day and age. And also, when you look at the instruments, and I like what you said about how the various institutions are failing. So if you look at the regional instruments that we have, and in this context, I'll refer mainly to the treaty, is why it doesn't look like a problem really legally is when they're talking about rule of law. The envisioned rule of law is, I mean, maybe they didn't envision it being in a situation where the law itself is being used to curtail, these rights, as we've highlighted the aspects of Tanzania. And so for me, my comment is, let's not flatter it by calling it authoritarianism and just call it as is, because it is dictatorship. And while at it, Daktari, also, I think it's a good place to remind you that as your audience, you do owe us that reply to Dr. Owiso now that he's here. So it's a good thing that you do remember that, and you grant that to the audience.
Alvin, please don't put me on the spot. I am a moderator. There's something about being a moderator that doesn't allow you have to, espouse some sense of neutrality. But in case there's time, I will do it. But before we go to Luciana on this, I don't know whether Philip, you can talk. If you can, I've permitted you to speak. You can possibly unmute and you have the floor.
Asante sana Daktari. Now that my Swahili is finished, I'll turn to English. Thank you very much for this discussion. It's been very insightful. And I'm wondering, from the lessons we are picking from Tanzania, what can we do to improve the quality of Uganda's forthcoming election, January 2026? I thank you.
Thank you so much, Philip. I think that is a question that I think all our panelists can deal with or can try to address. But I would like to ask Luciana to start, and you can answer both, because you have a specific question that goes to you, and then you have this the general question Philip has asked. What can Uganda realistically do based on the events we saw in Tanzania in their election or non-election, as we have been told?
Thank you. I think one of the best terms I've heard to describe the kind of democracy that Tanzania has is a top-down democracy. It's the democracy that the president allows. So as far as the president allows, that's the level of democracy, which I guess is similar to what you have in Uganda. To the question about the difference between a dictator and an authoritarian. The reason why we retain the use of the term authoritarian is, whereas we have lived under dictatorships before where there's absolute control by the president, there are certain limits. At least let me speak for Kenya. There are certain limits on the imperial presidency that we had before. There are certain things that the president cannot get away with. And that is why in all of these contexts, you see the authoritarians trying to use the force of the law to get their way. In a dictatorship, they don't even attempt to comply with the law. They just make the law and they just do whatever they want, and what they say becomes the law. But with modern authoritarian regimes, you see an attempt to put a legal veneer on their actions. And that is what separates dictatorships from modern authoritarians. This idea that we do believe because the international community compels us to operate under the rule of law, we will attempt to appear as if we are operating under the veneer of the rule of the law, but we all know the law is what we say it is. And that, I think, is a distinction between what we've seen in dictatorships and what modern authoritarians are doing. Remember, for authoritarians, the idea of not getting international scrutiny and international condemnation remains important. Let's look at Tanzania and what has been happening with their support from the EU. The fact that there's a possibility of not getting aid, which is the same reason why Magufuli really clamped down on the opposition, becomes a reason for saying, let's have an appearance of democratization, whereas in fact we do know that there is no democracy on the ground. Because the international the legitimacy on the international front becomes very important. So what can we do? I think, first of all, and this goes to what Owiso was asking earlier, is it backsliding if we didn't have democracy to start with? I think the better term to use for the democracy project in East Africa is redemocratization rather than pushing back on backsliding. There was a feeling that when the third wave happened in the 90s, that we were on solid ground. But I think the process of democratization should be considered more in waves. You ebb and you flow. There are times you do very well, and there are times you flow back. And I think if you look at Kenya, if you look at the cusp where we were in 2002, there was a place where we could see that there was a move towards institutional legitimacy. We believed in government. We believed in elections. We believed that there was a possibility of elections changing outcomes. And we saw that happening with the transition of power in 2002. So it's important to think about the process of democratization currently as more towards redemocratizing and building democratic resilience rather than pushing back on backsliding, because there's no perfect democratic experiment in my assessment. So what can be done? Let's not focus on elections, because it's very clear by the time elections are happening in our region, the playing field is not even. The opposition is fighting with one hand behind their back. And there's very little that you can do when you are outside the frame of power to change that narrative. But what I do know, which we can do, is first of all, think about three things. As citizens, we look at institutions as what protects us, but we must also think of our role in protecting institutions. It's a symbiotic relationship. We think about institutions as being there as these neutral arbiters, but these institutions cannot exist if we don't protect them as citizens. So let's think about, as part of the building resilience, democratic resilience, what can we do locally? And Tito already spoke to this question. How are we starting at the level closest to us to build institutions? And then how are we doing it nationally? And then how are we doing regionally? The reason why this is important is because, as we have seen in the entire conversation, democratization is not a process that can be done only nationally. Elections are not helping us. If this is going to work, because of the borrowing of authoritarian tendencies, we must have collaboration across the region. So what can we start to do in our own spaces now, locally, nationally, and then how can we build solidarity across the region? And I really love what the legal fraternity is doing in pushing back against repression using the legal processes in Uganda and Tanzania. That mechanism is what helps us to build resilience, that you're not alone, that if I'm fighting treason in Tanzania or in Uganda, I am not alone. That is a very critical part of sustaining the democratic resilience agenda. The other thing that we must consistently think about is that there is no silver bullet. There is no one thing that we are going to do that is going to fix the democracy project or the resilience project in Africa. And that's why it's very hard to tell you, Uganda, do this, Tanzania, do this, Kenya, do this. I think it's important to think about it the way Larry Diamond says it, in three prongs. There is a question of power. Where is the power? Where does the power lie? Which are the institutions that we can look at to constrain excesses? And that's why I said earlier, if an institution is working to help you constrain excesses, protect it with everything you have. Secondly, we must think about legitimacy. Do the people genuinely believe in the democracy project. And this is, I think, where we must bring in civic education as part of the re-energizing the democracy project. People are tired of governments that don't change anything. But people must also remember that the power resides in them. The day the people lose hope, democracy is lost. And that is why we must not get tired of energizing people towards believing that democracy is worth saving, it's worth investing in. I think the third thing that we must think about is and Tito already spoke towards this, how do we push for performance? What people are unhappy with is governments that do not perform. So how do we push for governments to deliver services? How do we create accountability for what governments say they're going to do when they come into power? How do we push back on narratives that are dividing the people and not offering them any tangible outcomes? If we consistently push back because we have the numbers, as was said earlier, we have the capacity to take back control of this vehicle that is democracy. Finally, I think we must also, even as we're working regionally and nationally and locally, we must also be asking what context-specific interventions should we be making? So all of these contexts are not similar. We've seen Kenya is slightly different from Uganda. Uganda has more similarity to Tanzania. What specific approaches should we be taking in those contexts that may not necessarily be needed in Kenya? So whereas, for example, internet suspension has worked in Tanzania and Uganda, it has not worked very well in Kenya because, again, of the resilience of the people. So the intervention that might be needed in that context may not be needed in Kenya. But if we have seen that legal changes are being introduced across the context early, all of us should be working to check what legal interventions are being introduced to change the playing field early and starting to work on those. So what is in common? Let's consolidate. What is different? Let's get context-specific interventions. And those can only be done in collaboration with those contexts. Allow me to just yield the floor back and say thank you, Harrison.
Thank you so much. Because of time, Luciana, please allow me to treat this as your final thoughts, because we just have less than 8 minutes to go, and then invite Tito to give his commentary to this, also as part of his final thoughts and a whistle. Tito, if you can take a max of 3 minutes, it will be better, and a whistle also, so that we try and finish by the top of the hour. I had promised everyone who has attended that we started late, but I will push us to finish on time. So you have the floor.
No, thank you so much, Mwalimu. I almost ran because I need to catch transport, and I was fearing that it would go on further. My reflection, rather my call to action, would be to embrace a few things. One, shared learning. Learning from each other, it won't harm. I know I always joke that we Kenyans and Tanzanians are siblings and we have these petty fights, but it wouldn't harm if we visit Kenya to learn about how the judiciary works, because it's one of the very few organs of the state that you can run to confidently and expect a fair result, though not always. So shared learning, that is it personalities that have shaped the judiciary, or is it the constitution, or is it the people that have shaped it through usage? So some of these lessons are pertinent. And why is it important? Because when the institutions of justice are paralyzed, you obviously resort to violence. You obviously resort to violence because you cannot cow all people in silence. In our case, we are 70 million now, probably more, because these are official statistics. So how able are you to silence this entire population? So if you think critically, you realize that there's no way you can silence everyone all the time. So to curb some of these outbreaks, we may have to be a little bit more deliberate on what we want, but also helping these voices to kind of be oriented on ideologies that work. Because, for example, Maandamano, I saw someone bashing the LSK, that they are now discouraging Maandamano, they're encouraging participation. it was a fair comment that why do you think maandamano is disruptive? Maybe because tunaandamana and then we go back home. We wait another protest, wait another protest. So some of these initiatives and outbreaks that are led by young people have to be shaped in a way that speak to agenda. We know what we want, and I'm not discouraging maandamano, but at least we have got to have a little bit of ideological dispensation that also speaks to sustainability, continuity, and the perpetual nature of the movement that we want. So that's all from myself, and thank you for having us, and thanks to everyone. I've learned a lot.
Thank you so much, Tito. Dr. Owiso?
Yes. So just in conclusion, I would say let's we need a narrative shift as citizens of Jumuiya, because there's always this tendency, and I think we borrow this a lot from some Western institutions that are always quick to say, well, that election was good enough. Not very good, but good enough. But then good enough for who? And good enough for what purpose? We should, at least from where I sit, we need to resist the urge as citizens of Jumuiya to settle for good enough. And that means we have to demand better of ourselves and better of our own, of and from our own institutions. And I believe that one way of doing this is recognizing that, as Tito was saying, there's a lot of power in civil society being the people. I'm using that term to refer to the people of the community. There's a lot of power in the people itself. Dictators and election thieves, so to speak, dislike and they literally hate active citizenry and active citizens. So I do not see what would stop us from having a people-centered and a people-driven electoral process where all of us as a collective across these artificial borders have a people-centered, people-driven electoral process of election monitoring and calling out stuff and demanding better. More like shadow election observation, but by the people and for the people, which we could do quite well through, solidarity, crowdsourcing of, whatever resources we have, citizen journalism and all that, and working with, other like-minded institutions. Probably I could say the Thabo Mbeki Institute, but that's just an example. So working across borders in solidarity, crowdsourcing and crowdfunding, so to speak, active citizen journalism. That to me is a simple way of pushing back against the narrative of good enough, because our leaders and our dictators have actually lapped onto it and said, well, we are not perfect. We've given you something that is possible, accept it and move on. We need to push back against accepting the bare minimum. And of course, in the interest of language, and apologies to Karugaba, I'm not going to say anything new, I'm just going to say the same thing in Swahili. So wito ningetoa ni hivi: Jumuiya ni yetu, jumuiya ni sisi. Ingawapo kuna changamoto tele jumuiani, haswa kidemokrasia na kiutawala, kinachonipa moyo na furaha ni kwamba polepole wananchi wa jumuiya wameanza kuungana. Wananchi wameanza kushirikiana, wameanza kusaidiana kwenye uharakati. Mashikamano haya ni muhimu sana kwa sababu ni dhahiri kwamba viongozi wetu na wanasiasa wetu hawajali maslahi yetu kama wananchi hata kidogo. Hivyo basi mkombozi wetu ni sisi wenyewe. Hakuna atakayetoka kwingine kuja kutukomboa. Na langu ni kusema tujiamini kama wanajumuiya, let's believe in ourselves. Tunayo nguvu na tunayo uwezo wa kugeuza wimbi. Ni hayo tu. Asante.
Asante sana. Thank you. That was a wonderful conclusion. I want to take this opportunity to thank all the panelists who have come and those who have left. Thank you so much, Tito. Thank you so much, Luciana. Thank you so much, Dr. Wiso. I want to give a very special thank you to Chepkorir Sambu for setting this entire event up. She has worked very hard, including being present when she just landed into Kenya from South Africa. Thank you to Emily Osemo for being part of the engine that makes this possible and runs this. This would not have been possible without the abilities and the strength that these two wonderful women put into this process and the passion that they put in. So I really want to thank them for organizing this. Thank you everyone who has attended. We will not have had a good conversation without your attendance. I really want to appreciate our audience for coming in. I want to appreciate our institution. I want to appreciate my co-editor-in-chief, Professor John Osogo Ambani, for giving us this kind of a platform, and the university as a whole, Kabarak University, for making all of this possible. We are now at the very top of the hour. I will ask Salome to close with a word of prayer, and we can declare this meeting closed. Thank you very much.
Thank you for the interactive session. Let's close with a word of prayer. Father God, we come before you this evening. We say thank you for the day you have given unto us. Thank you for the great session that you have enabled us to have. And I ask you that as we depart to our various places of work and our homes, I ask you that you may be with us, that you may continue helping us and continue helping us to understand and internalize whatever has been discussed in this session. And whatever I've not prayed for, ask the Holy Spirit to intercede on my behalf. Whatever I've prayed wrongly, I ask you that you may forgive me. In Jesus' name I pray and believe. Amen.
Amen. Amen. Thank you very much. I will now like to declare our webinar officially closed. Bye-bye and thank you.